Such a simple background for a blind date.
She is my mother.
They mocked the poor Nanny on a blind date, but the CEO's daughter climbed onto her chair and said, "Mom?" The chandeliers glimmered above the pristine white tablecloths, casting soft gold across the elegant dining room of Bellagio Prime, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Waiters in pressed black uniforms glided between tables. Champagne flutes clinked. Soft piano music played in the background. It was the kind of place where expensive cologne lingered in the air and the mere presence of a camera was considered gauche. The evening hum of laughter and conversation wavered when the door opened. She stepped inside hesitantly, pausing just past the entrance. A few heads turned, then more. Murmurs followed. A young woman stood awkwardly under the soft light. She wore a white blouse that looked gently worn at the sleeves, tucked into a plain navy skirt. Her blonde hair was tied into a neat ponytail. No curls, no makeup, no diamonds, just honest simplicity. She looked around, unsure, before approaching the maitre d's desk. I'm here for a reservation," she said. The waiter arched an eyebrow. "Are you certain you are a guest, miss? This is the VIP section. Private bookings only." The question, while politely framed, was laced with disbelief. From a nearby table, 3 women dressed in tailored silk leaned in closer, their voices low but cutting. "Who let her in?" one whispered. "She's probably someone's assistant." "No," another smirked. "She looks like a nanny, or a waitress off shift." A ripple of laughter followed, masked behind wine glasses. The woman flushed. Her cheeks turned pink, but she straightened her shoulders. "My name is Adele," she said softly. "I'm here for a blind date reservation. It should be under Alan Hale." The waiter checked the list, then reluctantly gestured toward a beautifully set table by the tall window. "Right this way." Adele walked carefully, feeling the weight of every stare. The click of her modest heels echoed louder than the live piano. As she sat down, she tried to ignore the group of women still watching her, their amusement, unkind and unrelenting. She rested her hands in her lap, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. She had almost canceled this, almost turned around when she saw the valet's judging glance. But something told her to stay. Just as she reached for her water glass, a flash of pink entered her peripheral vision. Small footsteps. Fast. Suddenly, a tiny figure rushed across the dining floor. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, wearing a bright pink dress, her hair tied into 2 pigtails with white ribbons. She didn't hesitate for a second. She ran straight toward Adele, climbed up onto the velvet cushioned chair beside her, and threw her arms around Adele's neck. "Mom?" The child's voice broke with emotion. "Mommy, is it really you?" The entire restaurant fell silent. A server dropped a fork. The trio of women gawked, mouths slightly open, and from the far end of the room, a man in a tailored charcoal suit stopped mid-stride. Alan Hale, the CEO scheduled for this blind date, stared in disbelief, because the little girl now clinging to Adele was his daughter. Adele had never quite belonged anywhere glamorous. At 27, she spent most of her days chasing toddlers, preparing peanut butter sandwiches, and folding tiny socks. She was a full-time nanny, not by accident, but by choice. Children made sense to her in a way adults often did not. They were honest, curious, and never cared about brands or bank accounts. She lived in a modest, 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a faded brick building. The place creaked in the winter and heated up like an oven in the summer, but it was her safe corner in the chaos of the city. Most months, she stretched every dollar just to keep the lights on. Still, she always paid rent on time and managed to buy little gifts for the kids she cared for. Her natural blonde hair was never professionally styled, just brushed and tied back into a ponytail each morning. Her face was soft, gentle, but carried the kind of quiet strength that came from years of being underestimated. She had once loved someone deeply, a man who promised forever, but his wealthy family saw her as little more than a phase. "A nanny is not a future wife," they whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Eventually, the pressure crushed the relationship, and she was left alone with a heart full of lessons she never asked to learn. Adele did not sign up for the blind date. Her roommate, who insisted Adele needed to reclaim her life, filled out the application online without telling her. When she found out, she was mortified, but somehow, after much convincing, and a week of her roommate hiding all the cereal boxes until she agreed, Adele gave in. "Who knows?" her roommate had said with a hopeful grin. "Maybe someone's finally smart enough to see you." That someone, supposedly, was Alan Hale. At 35, Alan was the kind of man who appeared in business magazines and investor reports, the CEO of Hale Tech. He was brilliant, focused, and driven. He had taken over his father's struggling company and turned it into one of the most innovative firms in the industry. Every minute of his life was scheduled, and emotions were carefully tucked beneath crisp suits and strategic decisions. But his success came with loss. 3 years earlier, his wife had passed away suddenly, leaving behind a grief so deep it silenced him. Since then, he had buried himself in work and in raising his daughter, Anna, the one piece of her mother he had left. Anna was 5 years old, full of questions, sunshine, and unshakable preferences, especially when it came to fashion. She insisted on wearing pink dresses every day because, as she told everyone, pink was Mommy's favorite color. Alan never argued. He bought pink cardigans, pink shoes, even pink hair ribbons. It was a battle he chose to lose, gladly. Though he adored his daughter, Alan never considered dating again. His heart was locked behind grief, and he believed no one could fill the space his wife once held. It was only at the quiet urging of his sister, who claimed Anna needed a chance at a full family, that Alan reluctantly agreed to a blind date. He never expected anything from it, but then came the misunderstanding that changed everything. Earlier that day, Alan had left Anna in the care of a temporary babysitter while he prepared for the evening. The sitter had stepped away for a phone call, assuming Anna was napping, but Anna, curious and unusually quiet, had slipped out of the apartment and wandered down the familiar streets toward the shopping district. She had a goal in mind. She was going to find her daddy. What guided her feet, however, was not just instinct. For weeks, while playing at the local park, Anna had noticed a woman with blonde hair standing at a distance. The woman never approached, never spoke. She would simply watch from across the lawn with a soft, almost sad smile. Anna had memorized her face. That woman was Adele. To a child like Anna, it made perfect sense. The woman kept showing up. She had Mommy's hair, Mommy's eyes, Mommy's warmth. So when Anna saw Adele inside the restaurant, sitting alone, something clicked. Without hesitation, she ran to her. Without doubt, she wrapped her arms around her. And without fear, she whispered the word she had longed to say. "Mommy." Alan reached them in long, quick strides. His voice was low, firm, and cut through the silence that had swallowed the restaurant. "What did you do to my daughter?" he asked coldly, placing a protective hand on Anna's shoulder. Adele's eyes widened. I didn't do anything. I swear." Before she could finish, Alan gently but firmly lifted Anna from her lap. The little girl clung to Adele's blouse, her fingers tightening. No, Daddy, stop." Anna cried out, her face flushed and streaked with tears. "That's Mommy. I know it's her." The words fell like stones across the quiet dining room. Gasps echoed from nearby tables. The same trio of women who had mocked Adele earlier leaned in, wide-eyed, delighted at the drama. "Well," one whispered, "I guess the blind date got more interesting. She's clearly trying to scam him. Poor man. Look at him, completely thrown off." Adele sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Alan's face was unreadable, but his gaze flicked quickly between her and his daughter. He noticed, for the first time, the color of Adele's hair, that exact shade of soft gold that his wife once had. Still holding a sobbing Anna in his arms, Alan turned to Adele. "We need to talk, now." He led them to a quieter corner, away from the eyes and whispers. He set Anna down beside them, but she refused to let go of Adele's hand. Alan looked at Adele, his expression taut. "You have one chance. Explain." Adele took a steady breath. Her voice was gentle, but clear. "I'm not her mother," she said. "I didn't know she would be here tonight. I had no idea she was your daughter. I'm just a nanny, full-time, for a family that lives near the park on Camden Avenue." Alan's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious. "Then, why was she so convinced you're her mom?" Adele hesitated, then looked down at Anna, who had quieted but still stared up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. "I volunteer at a shelter on weekends," Adele continued softly. "A few years ago, there was a little girl. She was abandoned by her parents. I helped care for her until she was adopted. I still think about her all the time." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Your daughter, she looks like her, acts like her. And I don't know why, but something about her, it pulled me in. I would bring the kids I watched to that park, and every time I saw Anna, I couldn't stop myself from watching. Not because I wanted anything, just because she reminded me of someone I couldn't forget." Alan stared at her, unsure. Her words were simple. There were no grand performances, no excuses, just quiet truth. He studied her face, the calm, unflinching gaze, the faint trembling in her hands that she tried to hide, the way she never once looked away. Anna tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, please let her stay, just for tonight." Alan exhaled, long and slow. He looked down at his daughter, then back at Adele. The logical part of him urged caution, but the father in him, the man who had seen his daughter cry herself to sleep for months, the man who had begged the universe for something to soften the loss, could not ignore what was right in front of him. Without saying another word, Alan returned to their original table. He pulled out the third chair, the one across from him. Then, with a tone just barely softer than before, he looked at Adele. "You might as well stay," he said. "If you leave now, it'll only break her heart worse." Crescendo. The waitstaff, the guests, even the women who mocked Adele, watched in stunned silence as she slowly walked back toward the table, this time not as a mistake, but as someone chosen to stay. Dinner had barely begun, but the tension at table 9 was already thicker than the creamy bisque being served. Alan sat stiffly, his expression unreadable as he poured water into Adele's glass. Adele sat beside him, her hands folded politely on her lap, trying her best to ignore the eyes burning into her from every corner of the dining room. The whispers had not stopped. If anything, they had grown louder now that she had returned to the table with Alan, and with his daughter clinging to her arm. From the next table, the same group of overdressed women who had snickered earlier leaned in again, their lips curled in sneers. "Is he serious?" one murmured, sipping her wine with exaggerated elegance. "A CEO dining with a nanny? She probably used the kid to trap him." Their laughter, though hushed, was sharp enough to pierce Adele's skin. Alan heard every word. His grip on the silverware tightened, his jaw locked. He started to shift in his seat, his body angling as if he was about to stand and confront them. But before he could move, Adele gently placed a hand on his wrist. Her touch was featherlight, but grounding. She leaned toward him slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's all right," she said. "I'm used to it." Alan looked at her. Her eyes didn't flinch. There was no bitterness, just quiet acceptance, the kind that came from years of being underestimated, dismissed, overlooked. Something in him softened. He didn't stand. He didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he looked at his daughter, who had squirmed out of her own chair and was now curled up on the velvet bench beside Adele. "Eat your vegetables, Anna," Alan reminded, but the girl ignored him completely. Anna was too busy cutting a piece of strawberry cake on Adele's plate. "Here, Mommy," she said, her voice full of joy. You have to try this one. It tastes like pink clouds. The room grew noticeably quieter. A few diners paused their meals. A server dropped a spoon. Someone gasped. But Adele just smiled gently. Thank you, sweetheart, she said, taking the bite without hesitation. Alan observed the exchange with quiet astonishment. Anna, his Anna, was touching someone new, talking, smiling. Since his wife passed away 3 years ago, Anna had barely let any woman come close. After the funeral, she had stopped speaking for weeks. Alan had hired therapists, nannies, teachers. No one got through. Until now. Until Adele. He stared at the two of them, his daughter clinging to a woman she had known for less than an hour, and that woman looking back at her like she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. It didn't make sense, but it felt real. Suddenly, the scrape of a chair cut through the silence. One of the women from the next table stood up. Her diamonds sparkled under the chandelier, but the look in her eyes was anything but kind. She raised her voice so the entire room could hear. A nanny pretending to be a mother? She scoffed. How pathetic. A poor woman like you. What could you possibly teach a child? Pity doesn't make you a parent. Gasps spread across the restaurant like wildfire. Adele froze. Alan stood. For the first time in 3 years, Alan Hale raised his voice in public. That's enough, he said sharply, his tone cutting through the room like glass. Everyone turned toward him. I don't care what she does for a living. What matters is what she has done in the last hour, something no one else has been able to do in 3 years. He stepped closer to Adele and Anna. She made my daughter smile again. She made her feel safe. His eyes locked on the woman who had spoken. And if that makes her unworthy in your world, then maybe your world isn't worth very much. The woman blinked, stunned. She sat back down, speechless. The room fell into a stunned silence. Alan returned to his seat. And this time, when he looked at Adele, it wasn't with suspicion. It was with something gentler. Something beginning to resemble respect. And maybe the first flicker of trust. Alan did not sleep that night. After the dinner, after the confusion, after the stunned silence in the restaurant, he sat at his desk long after Anna had gone to bed, her pink dress tossed over the arm of the couch like a soft flag of peace. His laptop glowed in the dark, casting sharp light across his face as he scrolled through files, employee records, and application histories. He was not investigating Adele out of suspicion. He was investigating her because he needed to understand. Why did his daughter react to her like that? Why, after 3 years of silence and withdrawal, had Anna clung to a complete stranger, like she had known her forever? He searched the nanny applicant files from 2 years ago, back when he was hiring full-time help for Anna after her first major emotional shutdown. There she was, Adele Rowan. Her photo was simpler than the others. No makeup, no retouched smile, just her blonde hair pulled back and her eyes steady, clear. She had applied for the job, same agency, same position. Alan's stomach twisted as he read the notes beside her profile. Rejected by assistant. Status: not aligned with public image. Candidate considered too modest for CEO representation. He leaned back in his chair, a knot forming in his chest. He hadn't even seen her application. His former assistant, more concerned with appearances than qualifications, had dismissed her without a second glance. If Adele had been hired, then would Anna have smiled sooner, laughed more, found comfort in a world that had suddenly gone silent? The next morning, Alan did something unusual. He picked up the phone himself. "Adele," he said, when she answered, her voice cautious. "I owe you an apology." There was a pause on the other end. "For what?" "Dashing. For not choosing you 2 years ago," he said quietly. "I never even knew you applied. I wish I had." Adele didn't speak for a moment. Then came her soft reply. "You didn't know. I should have," he said. "Would you consider coming by the house? Just for a visit? Anna's been asking for you. She hasn't stopped. Silence again. Then, okay. When she arrived later that day, Anna spotted her before she even reached the door. From the wide yard, Anna, dressed once again in her favorite pink dress, her little feet bare on the warm grass, looked up, saw Adele, and let out a shriek of joy. She ran, not the careful steps of a child greeting someone new, but the full-speed sprint of someone who had been waiting a long, long time. She barreled into Adele's legs, wrapping her arms tight around her. Adele dropped to her knees, catching the girl in a trembling embrace. Her hands cupped Anna's face, checking her cheeks, brushing her hair back, blinking rapidly. Alan stood by the doorway, watching them, his throat tightening. Anna pulled back just enough to look at her face. Her little voice broke into a whisper. "Mommy, don't leave me again." And, "Adele," Adele cried, not the quiet, polite tears of someone trying to stay composed, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place she didn't even know still hurt. Alan watched it unfold, frozen in the doorway. In that moment, something clicked. It wasn't logic. It wasn't coincidence. It was something softer, deeper, like a missing piece sliding into place. Adele wasn't trying to replace his wife. She wasn't pretending, or manipulating, or confusing his daughter with false promises. She had simply healed something without even trying. Alan realized then what all the therapists, specialists, and tutors had failed to do. This woman, this nanny they had once dismissed, had reached a part of his daughter no one else could touch. And for the first time in years, he saw a future that wasn't just work and grief. He saw the beginning of something whole. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind that made the world feel a little softer. The sky was a gentle blue, dotted with cotton clouds, and the park buzzed with laughter, strollers, and the rustle of wind through leaves. Alan, Adele, and Anna walked slowly along the winding path, the child skipping a few steps ahead, her pink dress fluttering in the breeze. Adele held a small bag of crackers, which Anna occasionally reached for with sticky fingers. Alan had rolled up his sleeves, his expression unusually relaxed as he watched his daughter giggle over pigeons. For a moment, everything felt normal, simple, even. Then it happened. A loud bark cracked the air like a gunshot. From the opposite side of the park, a large German shepherd broke free from its leash, bolting across the grass. Its growls were sharp, wild, less playful, more panicked. A smaller dog had triggered it, but the chaos sent children screaming and parents shouting. Anna turned at the sound. Her smile vanished instantly. The dog was headed in their direction. "Anna!" Adele cried out, but fear had already taken over the little girl's body. She stumbled backward, her face pale, her eyes wide. In her panic, she backed off the path, straight toward the curb, and the street. A horn blared. Alan's instincts surged. He sprinted forward, faster than Adele could react, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Just as Anna's foot hit the edge of the street, he threw his arms around her, pulling her into his chest, turning his body to shield hers. They fell hard onto the grass. The car swerved. The dog was caught by its owner seconds later. The world slowed. Alan lay still for a moment, one arm wrapped protectively around Anna's back, his breathing ragged, heart pounding like war drums. His suit was dirtied, his hands scraped. Anna trembled in his arms. He pulled her up carefully and looked into her teary eyes. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're okay." Adele rushed to them, her face white, her voice shaking. "Is she hurt?" "No," Alan said softly. "She's okay." Then something shifted. Alan gently handed Anna to Adele, the way one passes something sacred. The child clung to Adele's neck, her small fingers digging into the fabric of her blouse. Alan reached out and brushed Anna's hair from her face, his palm resting for a second on the back of her head. Then he said in the quietest, most vulnerable voice Adele had ever heard from him, "You're safe now because your mother's here." Adele froze, not because he said it to Anna, but because of the way he looked at her when he said it, there was no hesitation in his tone, no correction, no flinch, as if the words had simply risen from his heart before his mind had time to intervene. Around them, a few people had gathered. Parents, onlookers. A jogger had stopped. A woman covered her mouth, clearly moved by what she'd just witnessed. But Alan didn't care. He had always lived behind closed doors, behind glass offices and private drivers and walls no one could penetrate. But now, sitting in grass-stained pants, holding his trembling daughter, looking up at a woman he barely knew, he opened the door. Adele's breath caught in her chest. The man who had once been ice and distance, calculation and control, had just let love slip through in a single sentence. Her eyes welled unexpectedly. It wasn't just relief. It was something deeper. She saw the raw truth in him. The strength, yes, but also the aching loneliness he wore like a second skin. She saw the father who had carried so much without ever asking for help, the man who had protected, provided, and grieved in silence. And in that moment, as she held Anna in her arms, Adele realized something else. Her heart was no longer guarded. It was his. The next morning, the sky was gray. The kind of gray that pressed against your shoulders, heavy and still. Rain tapped quietly against the windows of Alan's townhouse, the rhythm soft, steady, and painfully calm. Adele stood by the doorway, her coat folded over one arm, her eyes unreadable. Alan was across the room, silent, watching her. Anna sat curled on the couch, her arms wrapped around her legs, confusion clouding her face. "I can't stay," Adele said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan's brow furrowed. "Why? What happened?" She hesitated, then looked down at the floor. "You know what happened. I don't belong in this world, Alan." "That's not true," he said, stepping closer. "You belong with Anna, with us." But Adele shook her head. "No. I'm a nanny, Alan. I ride the bus to work. I shop secondhand. I've had people laugh at me for the clothes I wear, the way I speak. And now, they're going to laugh at your daughter for loving someone like me." "She doesn't care about any of that," he replied. "Neither do I, but the world does." Her voice cracked. "And I won't be the reason Anna gets mocked behind her back or whispered about in her school halls. I can't." She stopped, swallowing hard. Then, slowly, she knelt down in front of the little girl who had become her whole world in the span of days. Anna crawled toward her, eyes wide and glistening. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adele reached out and tucked a damp curl behind the girl's ear. She smiled softly and whispered, "I'm not good enough to be your mommy, sweetheart." Anna's face crumpled. "No," she wailed, throwing her arms around Adele's neck. "Don't go. Please, don't go." Alan stepped forward, heart pounding. "Adele, don't do this." But it was too late. Adele pulled away, her fingers brushing through her blonde hair one last time as she stood. She gave Anna a kiss on the forehead, turned, and opened the door to the rain. Alan followed her down the steps. "Adele, wait," he called. She didn't turn back. She walked faster, coat pulled tight, shoulders shaking. A city bus came into view at the corner. She stepped onto it just as the doors began to close. He reached out, but the bus pulled away, swallowed by the fog and falling rain. Alan stood in the storm, soaked, stunned, aching. Beside him, a frail elderly woman struggled with a broken umbrella, shivering beneath the awning. Without a word, Alan slipped off his coat and handed it to her. Then, with trembling hands, he placed his own umbrella in her grasp, shielding her from the worst of the storm. She looked up at him in surprise, but he didn't wait for thanks. He turned and walked back toward the house, shoulders hunched, hair dripping, soul heavier than it had been in years. From the window upstairs, Anna watched everything. That night, she wouldn't eat, she wouldn't speak, and by morning, her forehead burned with fever. Alan sat beside her bed in the emergency room, gripping her tiny hand, his knuckles white. Machines beeped around them. A nurse moved quietly in the background. She's dehydrated, the doctor said gently, and her body is reacting to extreme emotional distress. Alan nodded, barely hearing. Anna turned her face into the pillow, moaning softly. He leaned close, brushing her hair back, his voice barely holding together. "Adele," he whispered. "Please come back." It was all he could say, because no matter how strong he was, he couldn't fix this alone. The rain had stopped by morning, but the sky was still pale and tired. Inside the hospital room, the lights were dim, and the air carried the sterile scent of medicine and heartbreak. Anna lay motionless in the hospital bed, her cheeks flushed with fever, her small body fragile under the thin white sheets. Alan sat beside her, his head bowed, one hand tightly clutching hers. He had never felt so powerless. Then the door burst open. A nurse turned, startled, but Alan already knew. Adele, soaked in sweat from running, eyes wide with panic, she rushed to the bed without a word. Alan stood as she fell to her knees beside Anna, reaching for the girl's hand. "Anna," she whispered, "sweetheart, I'm here. I'm here." As if summoned by the voice her heart had been crying for. Anna stirred, her eyelids fluttered. She blinked. Then her lips moved, weak and trembling. "Mommy?" Tears spilled down Adele's cheeks. "Yes, baby. Mommy's here. I'm not going anywhere." Anna sat up slowly and wrapped her tiny arms around Adele's neck, holding her as tightly as her strength would allow. "Don't leave me again," she sobbed. Adele kissed the top of her head, cradling her. "Never. I promise." Alan stood a few steps away, his eyes shining. Slowly, he walked toward them, heart pounding. He knelt down beside them, and when Adele looked up, he reached for her hand. His voice cracked. "You don't have to be perfect. You don't need the right shoes, the right clothes, or anyone's approval." He squeezed her hand tighter. "You just have to stay, so we can finally be a family." Adele stared at him, the tears in her eyes mirrored by his own. And she nodded. 1 year later, the Hale estate was filled with laughter. Under a canopy of fairy lights in the lush green garden behind the house, guests gathered for a small, elegant wedding. Soft classical music played. Rose petals floated through the air. Adele stood near the altar, her blonde hair softly curled and falling past her shoulders, a simple yet beautiful white dress hugging her figure. She looked radiant. Beside her, Anna skipped down the aisle, her face beaming, her hands carrying a small white satin pillow. She wore a pink dress, as always, because it was Mommy's favorite too now. When Adele reached Alan at the altar, he took her hands gently. "You ready?" he asked. She smiled. "I've been ready since the day your daughter called me Mommy." After vows were exchanged, after applause rang through the garden, they walked together through the crowd, husband, wife, and daughter. At the reception, people who once whispered behind napkins now stood speechless, including the same women who had once mocked Adele in that high-end restaurant. They watched as Alan Hale, the powerful CEO, stood behind his bride and gently tucked a strand of her golden hair behind her ear before the photographer snapped a picture. No one laughed now. They just watched in silence as love rewrote everything. As the sun dipped below the trees, and fairy lights glowed above them, Adele looked down at Anna, who had fallen asleep in her lap, cheeks sticky with frosting, curls tousled. Alan sat beside them, arm around her shoulder, and in that perfect moment, Adele whispered the words she had once been too afraid to believe. "They called me a poor nanny, but your daughter called me Mom, and that was all she would ever need to be." Thank you for watching this heartwarming story of love, courage, and second chances. If this tale touched your heart, imagine how many more are waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to Kindness and Love Tales for more emotional stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that kindness can change lives. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video with someone who believes in love that crosses every boundary. Because here, every story ends with hope, and every heart deserves a second chance. Subscribe now and never miss a moment of love, kindness, and love tales.
Heart change stories are not just tallies, they are journeys of pain, hope, and transformation. Stories that touch the soul, change perspectives, and remind us that even the broken heart can find a new beginning.